What a disappointing year for gaming it's been. There wasn't much coming out in the first place, and the few things I was looking forward to turned out to be major disappointments. Now I'm here making reviews for CC-approved gambling simulators. Uh-oh, there goes my chance of ever being sponsored by Hoyoverse. At least the girls are hot. But now that a week has passed, I think I can properly give my first impressions. Usually I wouldn't bother, but we have a somewhat rare situation where a divisive title has people debating whether it's complete trash or not, and I don't see my own take represented anywhere. Let's talk about the combat. Some say it's not good, it's too simple, and you can just button mash your way through it. Others argue it actually has quite a bit of depth, and you can't judge it based on fighting the tutorial bosses alone. Personally, I lean more towards the latter, but what if I said the game has its appeal aside from just its combat? I'll dive into the combat more in a bit, but Zenless Zone Zero is weird. It seems to be a different style of game than most people were expecting. It's not the adrenaline pumping, nuts to butts, balls to the walls action brawler we all thought it would be. I wasn't too into the marketing campaign, but I expected this to be a Hoyle versus game for fans who want a more mechanically challenging action title. That's not to say the game is without glaring issues, it absolutely has those, and in no short supply. I've been playing Hoyoverse games since not long after Genshin Impact came out, so I knew to keep my expectations in check, and while Genshin has always been more about exploration and engaging with the world than its combat mechanics, Zenless Zone Zero has a different focus, but it's one that's a bit harder to articulate. The slow, casual pace in which you move through the story and the world, the outrageous amount of detail in every little thing, it's impressive. Walking through the world, you'll see schoolgirls taking selfies and swiping through TikToks on their phone, the dailies involving mundane tasks like grabbing a cup of coffee and a scratch ticket, complete with Monster Hunter-esque cutscenes for these activities. These elements contribute to the game's atmosphere, making it weirdly absorbing and comfy. It might actually be the most comfy game I've played, and saying that about a gacha game is absurd. But what is comfy? What does it mean? It's hard to articulate. I'm not describing the game, I'm describing how I felt while playing it. But I do believe that's the intended feeling. When you think of a comfy or cozy game, what comes to mind? Stardew Valley is the first thing I think of, but that game is stressful. Nothing like losing track of time because your profit margin is 15% less than last year, and sprinting back home because it's past your bedtime only to pass out on the floor. It might be out of left field, but a comfy game for me is something like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, Witcher 3, or Cyberpunk 2077. Games that I find immersive in a way that emphasizes their atmosphere. Zenless Zone Zero certainly pays a lot of attention to its world. We're not dealing with a massive open world like in Genshin, but it feels like all that time spent making the world large and full of puzzles and unique mechanics has been allocated into the details of these smaller and more familiar hub areas. Let's dive into the story. To keep it brief and spoiler-free, you take on the role of either Wise or Bell in what seems to be the last living city on the planet, New Eridu. Monsters known as Ethereal have emerged from something called the Hollow and devastated the human population. Now that sounds pretty intense, but most of it is just setting. The story missions you undertake are mainly about the day-to-day life of our protagonist as a proxy, someone who guides others through these hollow zones. Comparatively, the protagonist of Genshin Impact feels like a fed-up isekai protagonist and is largely a blank slate. The protagonist of Honkai Star Rail is just a weirdo. In contrast, the protagonist of Zenless Zone Zero is decisively a professional. They take their job seriously and speak to most people in business terms, even their own siblings, who is essentially their business partner. When speaking with the locals of the neighborhood, they'll often try to sell them something. Turns out being a proxy doesn't actually pay all that well, so the siblings also run a video store. Overall, I enjoy the storytelling more than in Genshin Impact or Star Rail. The writing actually has some color in its cheeks this time, and characters have more of a personality. Generally, the writing aims more for humor, which is better than aiming for the word count. There's still a ton of fluff in the dialogue, but I'm pretty sure the writers are unironically paid per word. Just, I don't mind listening to it this time around when characters are allowed to express themselves and emote a little more. The cutscenes are really enjoyable too. Of course, the animation is almost obnoxiously good, but I really enjoy how expressive characters can be in them, as opposed to something like Genshin, making the characters feel way more like actual people. Hell, they can even be funny. You get a sense that this is a cast that have relationships with one another, real dynamics between them. It's easier to imagine people becoming attached to this cast than the cast for the other Hoyoverse games.
Now wait just a minute, Grace. Think about what you're saying.
Oh no! Grace might know everything about machinery, but she's single as hell! She knows nothing about love!
It's also pretty neat that you hear the dialogue choice you chose instead of just having to use your imagination for it. Honestly, it feels like the game is aimed squarely at Zoomers overall, with its high-paced, overly animated cutscenes and focus on lore and setting over a traditional narrative. Moving on to the gameplay, many, including myself, expected Zenless Zone Zero to focus heavily on its combat and action elements, but that really doesn't seem to be the case. Of course, you can't make an entire game about walking to the coffee store and grabbing something to drink, or more accurately, you can't make a gacha game intended to FOMO you into swiping for digital girlfriends by doing that. The combat isn't everything, but it is a major part of the gameplay, so how is it? Unlike most of the degenerates playing and covering this game, I play a lot of third-person action games, so I can give informed takes on the matter. I have no interest in coddling this game or going easy on it because it's a mobile game intended for salarymen to play on the ride to work. The question is it fun to play or not? Everyone has heard the sentiment of the game being a mindless button masher.
Have I even taken damage?
That said, people are waking up to the fact that the combat becomes a bit more mechanically demanding as you progress through. The tutorials just last way too long. Combat has quite a bit going on. You build a team of 3, ideally at least 1 stunner and 1 attacker. There's a basic attack, a special attack, and a team-wide ultimate. Ultimates need energy to be performed, special attacks need energy to be made an empowered version of themselves. So, the natural instinct is going to be pressing the basic attack again, and again, and again. I don't recommend playing this on mouse and keyboard unless you want to speedrun bricking your life with carpal tunnel. Seriously, you should grab a controller. Now this is moveset dependent, and yes, they did give characters a fighting game-esque move list, but characters have more that they can do than just spamming the basic attack. While the basic attack might be functional, it is rarely optimal. Anby's third basic attack can be followed up with either a hold to do more stagger damage, or using a special attack will let her interject it into the combo and continue the combo afterwards. The stupid wolf guy can hold down his attacks to charge them up in his normal attack string, and do way too much stagger damage. Dodging, perfect parries, and calling out assist when you take a hit ensure that the player always has powerful defensive mechanics at their disposal. Between all those, it's pretty easy to feel invincible, and that isn't strictly a bad thing, mind you. It's also not necessarily true. After all, the game has some of the worst player onboarding I've seen in a while, which is utterly shambolic considering the amount of time it takes you to get through the tutorial. Mashing basic attack gets you too far for far too long, and enemies just feel like sandbags. It really shouldn't take too long for a game to force you to engage with its own mechanics. That said, there are 2 things that a game like this can succeed on: the actual mechanical depth that it operates on and the style and feedback offered by the game. Ideally, a game would have both, but people are too quick to dismiss the later one. The new God of War games have some questionable decisions regarding their mechanics, but the sounds, fantastic animations, and the impact of every hit make it satisfying enough to play that it won't matter to the majority of players. The same is true for the remake of Final Fantasy VII. Cloud is incredibly satisfying to play due to how heavy his hits feel. Tifa hits pretty much just as hard, but I've never really enjoyed playing her because it feels like she's slapping the opponent with a wet paper towel. I would say this is something that ZZZ does incredibly well. The noise on a multi-hit parry is orgasmic.
Take this. Fracture.
Hits in general are very satisfying. The game has an assist combo feature that's reminiscent of the delayed hyper combos from Marvel vs. Capcom 3. In terms of how satisfying the game is to play, I have no complaints. Maybe the enemy design could be a bit more interesting, but that isn't the biggest deal. My issues arise with a couple of the mechanics. First of all, the camera is pulled in just a bit too close. I know this is for optimizing on the phone, but the option should be there for consoles and PC. At least we have an unlimited FPS option. Style does overtake substance in a few too many instances as well. While the parries are incredibly satisfying, the process is just a bit too automated for its own good. I feel like this is where some might have trouble articulating what the actual issue is. It's described as a one-button parry, but a lot of parries are one button. The problem is the automation. Most games aren't just about the timing, but also the positioning. Generally, you need to be in range of an attack to parry it. But this isn't really the case in ZZZ. The next character runs in and assumes a defensive stance, and if the hit connects, you'll get the parry automatically. And if the enemy attacks in sequence, the following attacks are parried as well. This ambiguity is kind of annoying. It isn't as comprehensible how many of these attacks in sequences you're going to parry, and you can take a hit that you feel like you didn't deserve. The enemies also might miss you during their sequence of attacks, leading to either confusion or, in worst case scenario, another hit that feels cheap. The automation also rears its head during these chain attacks. Again, they're reminiscent of the hyper combos from Marvel 3. I can really see the fighting game inspiration here. The problem is that they happen automatically, which can be incredibly annoying early game when enemies are broken by a stiff breeze, and you're trying to learn the moveset of the characters you're playing. It'd be nice to have the option to end the chain outright, maybe with one big hit to your current character. Now, getting these when you have to work for them is nice, but early game, and especially if you don't know what's going on, it feels like the game is playing itself. Ultimates being team-wide is also a bit of a confusing decision for me as well. It means the team building is hurt as damage is inevitably king for this game, what with DPS checks making up the majority of the challenging content. So for you to ever consider using an ultimate on a unit that isn't a DPS, it would have to lead to similar or more damage. That is something the game might get better at as time goes on, but for now, it's just a bizarre choice. As a side note, I find these ultimates a bit disappointing. They have cool, flashy animations, but many of them are characters doing stuff that they already do anyway. I can say with some confidence that this is going to change, but as of day one, it's pretty lame. For now, the combat is about stunning an opponent by breaking their stagger gauge and unloading as much damage as you can into them before they can recover. The stagger bar gameplay is becoming really common, and it's not hard to see why. It can scratch both the itch of having a back and forth with a competent opponent, while also letting you run wild and rack up insane damage numbers that you'd want out of an RPG. Overall, combat is incredibly satisfying. There's a solid amount of mechanical depth. More is certainly coming with new characters in the horizon that are going to offer different playstyles. Team building is a bit more rigid than I'd like it to be, but that is subject to change as well, and I do feel like the game is hampered by the feeling of automation, especially in the early hours. Now there's more to gameplay than just the combat. The second most notable style are these TV minigames. These have gotten a lot of hate over the course of the betas and during release, and it really isn't hard to see why. The TVs are a stand-in from the world, from like a bird's eye view that you navigate, but you'll find yourself constantly stopping for dialogue and tutorials that you might not care about. It does open up later on, and when it does, it becomes either much more bearable or even fun. It's certainly one of the more unique ways to tell a story I've seen, and the variety of gameplay styles on display here is commendable. You can go from playing Bomberman, Space Invaders, and Plants vs. Zombies over the course of just a few missions. Extra praise for how all of this is handled with the same basic control scheme. Later on, these TV sections become a roguelike dungeon for the Hollow game mode, which is similar to the simulated universe of Honkai Star Rail. Problem is that none of these strengths show themselves in the early game. It just feels like padding you have to slog through before you can get to the combat, which you aren't even certain you like at this point. I will say though that I do enjoy the TVs, and I hope that they commit to them in the future. Just make them a little less obtrusive. That being said, the real meat of the game really does feel like just living in the local area, picking up commissions, chatting with people, opening up the video store, stopping by the arcade for a round of Snake. Are these kids even trying? and giving recommendations to customers. It might sound like I'm inhaling serious copium, but I sincerely believe it. Combat feels tertiary to the experience, and if you come in strictly for that, you're almost certainly going to be disappointed. It's a part of the game, of course, one that has a lot of focus and detail put into it, but so is almost everything else. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the gacha of this gacha game as well. To keep it brief, it's horrible. I couldn't imagine a game being worse than Genshin with this, but you're drip-fed the premium currency at an incredibly slow rate. The early game guarantees you an early 5-star unit that you'll probably get on your second day of playing. Annoyingly, the gacha feels like it infringes on the game more so than the 2 other Hoyo games I've played. I logged in on day 1 planning to unlock my dailies so I could get some sleep, but it took so long for the dailies to unlock, I began to panic, even skipping the story while constantly checking them. The game is incredibly stingy, and that alone is probably enough for me to withhold my recommendation unless you're either filthy rich or a masochist. At the very least, some QOL features are implemented, like telling you how far away you are from getting a 5-star. I think a big reason the game is met with such mixed receptions at first impressions is due to the standard approach both content creators and players rushing to endgame tend to take. Zenless Zone Zero feels antithetical to that approach. It feels like a game about stopping and smelling the roses, taking it slow, enjoying the day-to-day experience. My initial impression of Honkai Star Rail was it seemed like Persona 5, but without that distinct style and flavor that people loved about that game. Zenless Zone Zero brings that style and flavor back. The NPCs, shops, the deliberate, slow process create a unique experience. I've really enjoyed chilling out and taking it easy on tasks, listening to the nice background music as I make my way across the neighborhood hub world. There is a solid combat system buried in the game, but if you want to blitz through everything else to get there, you'll probably have a bad time. I think that with the right mindset, there's a lot to enjoy about ZZZ in its early stages. There's a ton of content, the writing is above average, though it's in no rush to get anywhere. The combat is fun, though it takes a while to get there. The minigames are pretty cool, though they take a while to get there. There's a pattern forming here. A lot of cool later game modes and features are unlocked as you go on. I still can't change my dynamic wallpaper a week in. Sure, I've been taking my time, but it does feel a bit excessive.
Just let me use Nicole already, Hoyo.
I've heard there are hangout events similar to the Persona series of games, and I'm excited to see those as well. All in all, I think Zenless Zone Zero is probably going to end up being my favorite Hoyo game. I enjoy Genshin because there really is nothing quite like it in terms of its combat, team and character building, and exploration. Star Rail is fine, but it's never been very interesting to me. It feels like a bog standard gacha game with a really high production value. But Zenless Zone Zero also feels like something special. It's just comforting to play, relaxing even. If that vague feeling of comfort and relaxation is something you value, it definitely could be worth looking into. That's about it. Those are my first impressions after a week at World Level 30. I'm not calling it that. If you were thinking about liking the video, subscribing, and hitting the bell notification for the latest and greatest ZZZ content, I recommend not doing that. I probably won't be covering this game again. My next video will likely be something different.